On August 2nd, 216 BC, according to the Greek historian Polybius, who interviewed survivors, somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans were slaughtered in a single afternoon on a dusty plain in southern Italy. Ancient sources disagree on the exact death toll, but even the most conservative modern estimates describe a massacre unparalleled in the ancient world. Think about those numbers. The largest army the Roman Republic had ever assembled, 86,000 men according to contemporary accounts, walked onto a battlefield barely a mile wide. By sunset, fewer than 15,000 would escape with their lives. Modern historian Adrian Goldsworthy equates the carnage to the massed slaughter of the British Army on the first day of the Somme. Except this happened in 6 hours with swords and spears under the August sun. By the end of this video, you'll understand how documented tactical genius transformed terrain, weather, and human psychology into weapons that made numerical superiority meaningless. I'm about to reveal 3 facts that military academies still study 2,200 years later. First, the formation contemporary sources called a crescent, a geometric shape that literally swallowed an entire army. Second, the environmental factor. Both Polybius and Livy described that blinded 80,000 men while leaving their enemies untouched. Third, the cavalry maneuver modern warfare doctrine still considers the perfect execution of mobile warfare. But here's what makes this story historically fascinating and militarily terrifying. How did Hannibal predict exactly where the Romans would concentrate their strength and turn that strength into their doom? What made veteran soldiers so disoriented that ancient sources describe them burying their own heads in the ground to suffocate? Why did the Roman Senate, after losing 20% of all fighting-age males in 6 hours, refuse to even discuss surrender? And why does every military commander from Napoleon to Eisenhower measure success against this single afternoon of ancient carnage? To understand how 50,000 men killed 70,000 in a space smaller than a modern shopping mall, we need to step back to the spring of 216 BC, when Rome made a decision that would bring it closer to annihilation than any enemy before or since. 28 years before Cannae, in 247 BC, a boy was born into a family that would never forgive Rome. Hannibal Barca entered the world as the First Punic War was grinding toward its bitter end. His father, Hannibal Barca, the surname meaning underscore, quote, underscore, zero underscore in the Punic language, had waged a brilliant guerrilla campaign in Sicily, conducting daring raids on the Italian coast that earned him both his nickname and Rome's enduring hatred. When Carthage finally sued for peace in 241 BC, the terms were crushing. Sicily, Carthage's wealthiest province, was surrendered to Rome. But worse was coming. 3 years later, while Carthage struggled through a vicious mercenary revolt, the truceless war chroniclers called it, Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica without pretext or warning. Ancient sources record that this naked territorial grab, this exploitation of Carthage's moment of weakness, created a wound in the Punic psyche that would never heal. Hannibal Barca took his bitterness and transformed it into policy. If Rome controlled the western Mediterranean islands, Carthage would build a new empire on the Iberian Peninsula. Spain's silver mines would fund the revenge. According to both Polybius and Livy, are 2 main ancient sources for these events. Hamilcar made his 9-year-old son swear an oath before the family departed for Spain. The tradition, preserved in multiple accounts, describes a ceremony at the Temple of Melkart in Carthage. Whether the oath was sworn exactly as ancient sources describe or represents a symbolic truth that grew in the retelling, the language is stark. Hannibal swore never to be a friend of Rome. Some versions have the boy declare he would use fire and steel to arrest Rome's destiny. Livy records that Hannibal swore, to prove himself an enemy of the Roman people as soon as he could. For 19 years, Hannibal learned warfare in the blood-soaked hills of Iberia. He watched his father die in a rearguard action in 228 BC, killed by hostile Spanish tribes with his sons present. He served under his brother-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, rising to command the cavalry, the elite strike force of the Carthaginian army. When Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BC, the army didn't wait for Carthage to send a replacement. The soldiers, veterans who had fought under 3 generations of Barcas, unanimously chose the 26-year-old Hannibal as their commander. What happened next forced Rome into the war it had been dreading. In 219 BC, Hannibal laid siege to Saguntum, a city on the Spanish coast that had allied itself with Rome. The siege lasted 8 months. Hannibal himself was wounded during the assault, but refused to leave. When the city finally fell, Rome sent envoys to Carthage demanding Hannibal's surrender. The Carthaginian Senate refused. A Roman diplomat named Quintus Fabius held out the folds of his toga before the Carthaginian assembly and said he held peace in one hand and war in the other. Which would Carthage choose? The Carthaginians told him to choose for them. Fabius let fall the imaginary war. But swearing to destroy Rome and actually threatening it required something military theorists considered impossible: getting an army to Italy when Rome controlled the seas. What Hannibal did next would shock the ancient world and cement his reputation as either a military genius or a madman. He marched his army through the Alps in autumn, leading 38,000 infantry, 8,000 cavalry, and dozens of war elephants over passes that claimed the lives of half his force. Those who said it couldn't be done were right about the cost. They were wrong about the outcome. The survivors who descended into the Po Valley in late 218 BC were hardened, loyal, and led by a commander who had proven that the impossible was merely expensive. By 216 BC, Hannibal had been in Italy for 2 years and had already destroyed 3 Roman armies. At the Trebia River in late 218 BC, he used a hidden ambush and superior cavalry to annihilate a consular army under Sempronius Longus. At Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, he executed what military historians call the largest successful ambush in history, trapping and killing the consul Gaius Flaminius along with his entire army in a narrow pass between the hills and the lake. Modern historians calculate that in 20 months, Hannibal had killed approximately 150,000 Romans without losing a single major battle. Rome was learning a new kind of fear, the kind that comes when superiority meets genius and loses. The spring of 216 BC found Rome in a crisis that threatened the Republic's very existence. After Trebia and Trasimene, after watching 2 consular armies evaporate, the Senate had appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator. Fabius understood what pride prevented most Romans from accepting. Hannibal could not be defeated in direct combat. The Carthaginians' tactical brilliance and cavalry superiority made open battle suicide. So Fabius implemented a strategy that would bear his name for millennia: shadow the enemy, harass foragers, avoid decisive engagement, let time and distance wear Hannibal down. The Fabian strategy was militarily sound and politically disastrous. Roman culture worshipped aggressive warfare, the decisive battle, the glorious triumph. Fabius's caution looked like cowardice to a populace that measured manhood by willingness to face death in formation. The Roman aristocracy, schooled in the art of military glory as the pathway to political power, chafed under a strategy that denied them the chance for martial distinction. When Fabius's 6-month term as dictator expired, the Senate made a collective decision that would nearly destroy the state. They would abandon defensive warfare and crush Hannibal through overwhelming force. The consular elections of 216 BC reflected this determination. Two men emerged to share supreme command, and their differences embodied Rome's internal struggle. Lucius Aemilius Paulus was a patrician from an established military family, experienced from campaigns against the Illyrians, cautious by temperament and training. He favored continuing the Fabian approach. Ancient sources describe him as prudent, wary of Hannibal's reputation, and justifiably concerned about fighting on open ground where Carthaginian cavalry held every advantage. Gaius Terentius Varro was his opposite in almost every way. A plebeian of lower social origins, what the Romans called a new man. Varro represented the fury of a humiliated people. Polybius and Livy, both writing from aristocratic perspectives, depict him as rash, overconfident, a populist who believed sheer Roman numbers would overwhelm Punic cunning. Modern historians note that Varro may have been scapegoated after the disaster. His low origins exaggerated, his mistakes amplified by sources protecting the reputation of the patrician Paulus. Particularly suspicious is the fact that Paulus had powerful descendants, including his grandson Scipio Aemilianus, who was Polybius's patron and protector in Rome. What cannot be disputed is the institutional flaw in Rome's system. When two consuls served together, they alternated supreme command on a daily basis. One day Paulus commanded, the next day Varro. This rotation, designed to prevent tyranny, created the tactical absurdity of an army with two different commanders making decisions 24 hours apart. Hannibal, watching from his camps in Apulia, understood the opportunity this presented. On days when Paulus commanded, the Romans would stay defensive. On days when Varro commanded, they could be provoked. The army these consuls would lead represented an unprecedented mobilization. Polybius records that, quote, 2, where Rome typically deployed 4 legions total, 2 per consul. This concentration doubled that force. Including allied contingents, the army numbered approximately 86,000 men. Roughly 40,000 Roman heavy infantry, 40,000 allied heavy infantry, 2,400 Roman cavalry, 3,600 allied cavalry, and 8,000 to 10,000 light infantry. But quantity had come at the cost of quality. After the catastrophic losses at Trebia and Trasimene, Rome had been forced to lower its property requirements for military service. Traditionally, only men with sufficient wealth to afford proper equipment could serve in the legions. Now, desperate for numbers, Rome was enlisting poorer citizens with less training. Many of the new recruits were raw, untested, thrust into formations alongside veterans before they'd mastered even basic drill. Modern scholars analyzing ancient accounts suggest the army remained essentially 2 separate forces, the veteran 4 legions and the newly raised 4 legions, that would be merged only days before the battle. This was Rome's gamble: mass over skill, numbers over tactics, the weight of Roman iron and Roman will crushing Punic cleverness through sheer, overwhelming force. It was the kind of thinking that had built an empire over centuries of Italian warfare. It would nearly destroy that empire in a single afternoon. Because while Rome assembled the largest army in its history, Hannibal was studying the terrain of southern Italy, looking for the perfect place to demonstrate why tactics matter more than numbers. Against Rome's massive citizen levy stood something fundamentally different. Hannibal's army was a professional mercenary force built from ethnic groups spanning the Mediterranean, speaking half a dozen languages, unified only by years of shared campaign and faith in their commander's genius. Ancient sources describe a force of approximately 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. though 8,000 Gallic infantry were left to guard the camps when battle commenced. The core of Hannibal's infantry were the Libyans, between 8 and 10,000 heavy infantry from North Africa. Polybius emphasizes that these were Hannibal's most experienced and disciplined troops, veterans of campaigns in Spain and the Italian invasion itself. What made them psychologically devastating was their equipment. After the Battle of Lake Trasimene, the Libyans had been outfitted with captured Roman armor and scuda, the distinctive rectangular shields of the legions. Contemporary accounts make clear this wasn't simply practical reuse of good equipment. It was psychological warfare. In the dust and chaos of battle, Romans would be unable to distinguish these enemies from their own soldiers until the killing had begun. Paired with the Libyans in the infantry line were two Celtic groups that couldn't have been more different in style. The Gallic infantry, somewhere between 16 and 21,000 warriors from the Boii and Insubre tribes of Cisalpine Gaul, represented the shock troops of Hannibal's army. Ancient sources describe them fighting naked to the waist or in minimal armor, wielding long slashing swords and carrying large but light shields. They were aggressive, fearsome in appearance, and less disciplined than the Libyans. But their ferocity in close combat made them ideal for the role Hannibal had planned for them. They would form the center of his line, the bait that would draw the Romans in. The Iberian infantry, 3,000 to 5,000 veterans from Hannibal's Spanish campaigns, were professional swordsmen. Polybius describes their distinctive white linen tunics with purple borders. Their primary weapon was the falcata, a curved sword that ancient sources indicate was brutally effective, capable of slashing through armor with its weight and edge geometry. These Spanish warriors would share the center with the Gauls, mixed in alternate companies to provide backbone and discipline to the Celtic fury. But Hannibal's decisive advantage wasn't his infantry. It was his cavalry, and the numbers tell the story. 10,000 Carthaginian horsemen against 6,000 Roman. A 5-3 numerical advantage that understated the actual gap. 4,000 Numidian light cavalry from North Africa rode unbridled horses with supernatural skill, carrying javelins and operating as fast-moving skirmishers who could harry enemy flanks, pursue broken formations, and regroup with speed that Roman cavalry couldn't match. 6,000 Gallic and Iberian heavy cavalry served as the hammer. Shock troops riding with four-horned saddles and carrying heavy spears, trained to charge in formation and break enemy lines through sheer momentum. Ancient sources record that the Balearic slingers, 2,000 specialists from the islands off the Spanish coast, were famous throughout the Mediterranean world. They carried 3 different lengths of sling for different ranges and could hurl stones or lead bullets with accuracy that made them more dangerous than archers at certain distances. One of these men would wound the Roman consul Paulus early in the battle, though he would continue to fight. The mathematical advantage Hannibal held in cavalry becomes stark when compared to infantry ratios. Modern military historians calculate that the Carthaginian force had 1 horseman for every 4-foot soldiers. The Roman army had 1 horseman for every 13 infantry. On the flat open ground of Cannae, this disparity would prove decisive. More than that, the Carthaginian cavalry were professionals, many of them born to the saddle, fighting in formations they had perfected over years of campaign. The Roman and allied cavalry were adequate, but not exceptional, primarily used for flanking support to infantry rather than independent operations. What unified this polyglot force was Hannibal himself. At 31 years old, he had spent 22 of those years on campaign. He spoke multiple languages, understood the fighting styles and psychological needs of each ethnic group in his army, and had demonstrated through 2 years of Italian warfare that he could coordinate complex tactical maneuvers across this diverse force with precision. The Carthaginian army that faced Rome at Cannae wasn't just a collection of mercenaries. It was a refined instrument of war. Each component specialized, each positioned where its unique characteristics would be most effective. The Romans had superior numbers and superior equipment. What they faced was superior integration, superior mobility, and a commander who understood that winning battles isn't about having more soldiers. It's about putting the right soldiers in the right place at the right time. Hannibal had spent 2 years learning how Romans fought. He knew they trusted in the strength of their infantry center. He knew they advanced in deep columns, trying to break enemy lines through mass. He knew exactly where they would concentrate their power. And he had designed a formation specifically to make that power destroy them. Cannae was nobody's idea of a decisive battlefield. The village itself had been reduced to ruins in previous conflicts, little more than scattered walls and burned-out buildings. But it sat next to the Aufidus River, and it controlled the largest grain supply depot in southern Italy when Hannibal seized the citadel in the spring of 216 BC. He accomplished something more strategically significant than another tactical victory. He took away Rome's ability to feed its armies in the region. Polybius provides the strategic context with characteristic precision. The capture of Cannae caused great commotion in the Roman army. For it was not only the loss of the place and the stores in it that distressed them, but the fact that it commanded the surrounding district. Rome couldn't ignore this. Hannibal had positioned himself between Roman forces and their supply lines. He had seized food that was meant to sustain legions through the summer campaign season. And he had made it clear he wasn't running, wasn't avoiding battle, wasn't playing the defensive game that Romans had grown accustomed to under Fabius. He was daring them to come get it back. The battlefield itself was deceptively simple. A flat, treeless plain stretched along the southern bank of the Aufidus River, modern Ofanto River, in the Apulian region of southeastern Italy. To an untrained eye, it appeared ideal for Roman tactics. No forests to conceal ambushes, no hills to complicate deployment, just open ground where superior numbers should prevail. But terrain is never neutral, and Hannibal had chosen this ground with the precision of a surgeon selecting where to cut. The Aufidus River anchored the northern edge of the battlefield, providing water in a region that baked under the August sun. More tactically important, it constrained maneuver on one flank. Any force positioned near the river had limited room to spread out, limited ability to wheel and reform. For cavalry-heavy armies, this might be a disadvantage. For Hannibal's purposes, it was perfect. The hills to the south provided the opposite constraint, forcing any large army deploying on the plain into a narrower frontage than it might prefer. For Rome's 86,000 men, this compression would have tactical consequences the consuls didn't foresee. The ground itself was composed of silty river soil, parched in the summer heat. When thousands of feet and hooves churned it up, it would create dust clouds that ancient sources describe as battlefield-defining. But what made this terrain Hannibal's weapon wasn't just the dust. It was the wind. Both Polybius and Livy emphasize a factor that modern readers might dismiss as minor, but ancient combatants understood as decisive. The seasonal wind known locally as the Volturnus, called the libeccio in the region, blew from the southwest. Livy records that Hannibal quote, _4, this wasn't happenstance. When Hannibal positioned his army facing north on the morning of the battle, he ensured that his soldiers would fight with the wind at their backs. The Romans, deploying opposite them, would face south, directly into the wind. As the battle progressed and dust rose from the churned earth, the Carthaginians would see clearly, while Romans choked on grit and fought blind. Polybius notes this was a great convenience to the Punic troops, while the Romans were blinded and choked by the dust stirred up by their own massive movement. There was one more element that made this ground deadly. The narrowness of the battlefield between river and hills meant that Rome's enormous army couldn't deploy in its standard formation. The usual Roman battle line featured maniples, companies of 120 men, arranged in a checkerboard pattern with intervals between units for maneuverability. This flexible formation allowed commanders to reinforce weak points and exploit enemy vulnerabilities. But on the compressed battlefield at Cannae, there wasn't room for 86,000 men to deploy with proper intervals. When Varro ordered the deployment, he was forced to pack the maniples closer together and increase the depth of the formation. Instead of a flexible checkerboard, Rome would advance as a deep, narrow battering ram. Everything about this ground favored the numerically inferior force, if that force could turn environmental factors and terrain constraints into weapons. Hannibal had studied Roman tactics for 2 years. He knew they would mass their infantry in the center and try to break through by sheer weight. He knew the narrow battlefield would compress them further, reducing their maneuverability. He knew the wind would blind them at the critical moment. And he knew his cavalry could use the river and hills to control the flanks while his infantry center absorbed and channeled the Roman assault. By late July 216 BC, both armies were in position. The Romans camped on the left bank of the Aufidus, close enough to see Carthaginian cook fires across the river. For several days, the armies engaged in minor skirmishing. Hannibal's Numidian cavalry harassed Roman water parties, a pressure that became acute in the summer heat. Small-scale probing attacks tested each side's readiness. But Hannibal was waiting for Varro's day to command, waiting for Roman impatience to overcome Roman caution. On August 1st, with Paulus in command, the Romans stayed in their camps. On August 2nd, Varro took control. At dawn, he ordered the entire army to cross the river and deploy for battle. Ancient sources record that Paulus objected, arguing that the open plain gave every advantage to Hannibal's cavalry. But Roman protocol gave Varro absolute authority on his day. The decision was made. The trap Hannibal had prepared through careful selection of ground, through understanding of wind patterns, through exploitation of Roman tactical doctrine, was about to spring. All that remained was for 86,000 Romans to walk into it. August 2nd, 216 BC, dawned hot and cloudless over the Apulian plain. By 8 in the morning, as Roman legionaries filed out of their camps and splashed across the Aufidus River, they could see the entire Carthaginian army already formed and waiting. 50,000 men arrayed in a formation that looked wrong to Roman eyes, a bulging crescent where a straight line should be. To the Romans accustomed to conventional warfare, it appeared to be a mistake, a weakness they could exploit. It was, in fact, one of history's most sophisticated tactical traps. Varro, exercising his authority as commander for the day, ordered immediate deployment. According to ancient sources, this was consistent with his character as they depict it. Aggressive, confident in Roman numbers, eager to demonstrate that overwhelming force could crush Punic cleverness. 76,400 men were formed for battle. 10,000 remained behind to guard the camps. Polybius provides the detailed breakdown. 40,000 Roman heavy infantry, 40,000 allied heavy infantry, and 6,400 cavalry divided between the wings. What Varro ordered next would have profound tactical consequences. Instead of the standard Roman deployment, a flexible checkerboard of maniples with intervals for maneuver. He commanded the formation be made deeper and narrower. The maniples were packed closer together, the files increased from front to back. Ancient sources describe a formation nearly twice as deep as it was wide. The intent was clear: create a human battering ram that would smash through the Carthaginian center by sheer mass and momentum. What Varro couldn't foresee was that this density would become a prison once the battle began. The cavalry deployment followed standard practice. 2,400 Roman citizen cavalry under Consul Paulus took position on the right wing near the river. 3,600 allied cavalry under Varro positioned on the left. Against them, Hannibal had massed his cavalry in unequal distribution. On his left wing, facing the Roman right, he concentrated 6,000 Gallic and Iberian heavy cavalry under a commander named Hasdrubal, not the brother who was fighting in Spain, but a trusted officer who commanded the shock cavalry. On the right wing, facing the Roman left, 4,000 Numidian light cavalry prepared for their role. The infantry formation Hannibal had created was geometrically elegant and psychologically sophisticated. In the center, he placed his Gallic and Iberian infantry in a convex crescent that bulged toward the Romans. These were his shock troops, fierce but less disciplined than his other forces. On both flanks of this crescent, held well back in reserve, stood the elite Libyan heavy infantry in their captured Roman armor. The formation from above would have looked like a bow strung with the arrow pointing at the Roman center. What the Romans couldn't know was that the bow was designed to flex backward, to absorb the Roman assault and channel it into a killing zone where the flanks could close. Polybius preserves what may be history's most confident pre-battle exchange, though whether the words were actually spoken or became part of Hannibal's legend. The anecdote reveals the commander's psychological approach. An officer named Gisco, viewing the massive Roman army, remarked on its terrifying size, more than double Hannibal's force. Hannibal replied, "Another thing has escaped your notice, which is more amazing still, that in all this multitude there is not one among them called Gisco." The joke spread through the Carthaginian ranks. Soldiers, seeing their general relaxed and humorous in the face of overwhelming odds, interpreted this as contempt for the enemy. Morale, already solid after 2 years of victories, strengthened further. The environmental conditions as battle approached were exactly what Hannibal had positioned for. The Volturnus wind was already rising with the morning heat, blowing from the southwest across the Carthaginian backs toward Roman faces. The August sun, though still climbing, promised a day of brutal heat that would sap the energy of men fighting in armor. The parched ground was already beginning to stir into dust with the movement of thousands of feet. Command positions revealed the confidence and tactical understanding of each side. Hannibal and his brother Mago stationed themselves directly behind the Gallic-Iberian center, the point where the Romans would hit hardest, the most dangerous position on the field. This was calculated. Soldiers, seeing their commander at the point of greatest danger, fight with greater resolve than those who know their leader's command from safety. The Roman consuls took traditional positions with the cavalry wings, Paulus on the right, Varro on the left, where Roman doctrine placed commanders to control the flanks and coordinate with infantry. By mid-morning, nearly 140,000 men stood on a battlefield barely a mile wide, the air between the armies filled with the final sounds before combat. Armor being adjusted, weapons checked, orders shouted, prayers muttered. Ancient sources record that the light infantry moved forward first, velitis against Balearic slingers, engaging in the preliminary skirmishing that opened ancient battles. Polybius describes this phase as indecisive, a distraction while heavy units finalized positions. But one small incident during the skirmishing would have consequences. A stone from a Balearic sling struck Consul Paulus, ancient accounts indicate. The wound wasn't fatal, but it added pain to Paulus's burden. He would spend the coming hours fighting wounded, his effectiveness compromised, his stamina draining faster than it should. When the day ended, he would be among the 70,000 dead. But for now, as the light infantry fell back and the heavy formations began their advance, Paulus remained with his cavalry on the right, preparing for what ancient sources describe as the most brutal cavalry engagement of the ancient world. The Romans looked across the dusty plain at an army half their size and saw victory. What they couldn't see through the rising dust and their own confidence was that every element of terrain, every aspect of weather, every detail of their own formation had been factored into Hannibal's calculations. The crescent they saw as weakness was strength. The open ground they thought favored them favored cavalry. The wind they barely noticed would blind them. Within minutes, 140,000 men would collide. What happened next would be documented by chroniclers on both sides as a masterpiece of destruction so complete that military theorists would study it for more than 2 millennia. The first major engagement erupted not in the infantry center, but where the Aufidus River constrained both cavalry forces into a corridor so narrow that the ancient art of mounted warfare degenerated into what Polybius calls true barbaric fashion combat. On the Roman right wing, 2,400 citizen cavalry under Consul Paulus faced 6,000 Gallic and Iberian heavy cavalry under Hasdrubal. The disparity in numbers was only part of the problem. The confined space between river and infantry formations negated every advantage cavalry typically enjoyed. There would be no wheeling maneuvers, no flanking charges, no graceful dances of mobile warfare. Just brutal, direct collision. Ancient sources describe what happened next with language that conveys shock at the nature of the fighting. The cavalry charged each other head-on in the narrow corridor. Almost immediately, the formation cohesion that defined cavalry operations dissolved. Horses collided and reared. Men were thrown or dragged from their saddles. The fighting became hand-to-hand, warriors grappling with opponents, stabbing with short weapons, using horses as platforms rather than as instruments of maneuver. Polybius's phrase, quote 9, suggests this was outside the normal conventions of cavalry combat, more like infantry fighting that happened to involve men who had ridden to the battlefield. The Roman cavalry, already outnumbered more than 2 to 1, lacked the training and cohesion of their opponents. These were adequate horsemen, capable of supporting infantry operations and pursuing broken enemies. But they weren't the professional shock cavalry that Hannibal had trained in Spain and tempered in Italy. The Gallic and Iberian heavy cavalry were specialists in exactly this kind of brutal close combat. Their horses were trained for it. Their riders had been doing it for years. The Paulus factor added to Roman difficulties. Ancient accounts indicate the consul had been wounded earlier by a Balearic slinger's stone. While he remained in command, fighting from the front as Roman tradition demanded, his effectiveness was compromised. Pain saps concentration. Blood loss drains stamina. A wounded commander trying to control a desperate cavalry battle against superior numbers in a confined space was fighting against mathematics and physics as much as against Carthaginian warriors. The Roman cavalry line began to buckle. What started as controlled combat deteriorated into panic. When the first Romans broke and fled along the riverbank, the unraveling accelerated. Ancient sources describe the pursuit as merciless. Fleeing cavalry, their backs to the enemy, were cut down without mercy. Some were ridden down and trampled. Others were caught at the water's edge, trying to cross the Aufidus. and killed in the shallows. The river, which had constrained the battlefield, now became a barrier to escape. Within perhaps 30 minutes of the initial charge, the Roman right-wing cavalry had been destroyed as an effective force. Some fled toward the camps. A few may have attempted to circle behind the battle to escape. Most died where they fell or in the pursuit. Hasdrubal's victory was complete, but what separated a good cavalry commander from a great one was what happened next. Hasdrubal could have pursued the fleeing Romans, racked up an impressive kill count, and effectively removed himself from the battle. Instead, he demonstrated the discipline and tactical understanding that made Hannibal's army so dangerous. He regrouped his squadrons. He let the Numidians handle the pursuit of broken enemies. That's what light cavalry did best. And he prepared for the next phase of Hannibal's plan. The destruction of the Roman right-wing cavalry had profound consequences beyond the immediate casualties. The Roman right flank was now completely exposed. The infantry, already engaged in the center, had no cavalry screen protecting their vulnerable side. More critically, 6,000 heavy cavalry were now available for redeployment. Hasdrubal, having won his battle in less than an hour, was about to become the decisive factor in someone else's fight. The Romans fighting in the infantry center, pressed forward in their deep formation, couldn't see what had happened on the river flank. The dust was already rising. The press of bodies and the tunnel vision of combat meant most legionaries knew only what was immediately in front of them. They were advancing. They were pushing back the Carthaginian center. As far as they could tell, the plan was working. What they didn't know was that their right flank had just evaporated, that thousands of enemy cavalry were victorious and regrouping, and that the officer commanding those cavalry understood exactly what needed to happen next. Consul Paulus, wounded but fighting on, must have understood the disaster unfolding. Roman cavalry doctrine placed the consul with the cavalry precisely to maintain coordination between mobile and infantry forces. When his cavalry wing disintegrated, he had to make a choice: flee with the survivors or move to the infantry center where his presence might rally cohesion. Ancient sources don't record his exact movements in the next phase, but they document where he died, in the thick of the infantry battle, surrounded by legionaries, fighting to the last. His choice, whether strategic or simply honorable, meant he would spend his final hours not with cavalry he couldn't save, but with infantry who couldn't save themselves. The first phase of Hannibal's masterpiece was complete. One Roman cavalry wing was destroyed. 6,000 Carthaginian heavy cavalry were victorious and available for new orders. The Roman infantry, oblivious to the disaster on their right, continued pressing forward into what they thought was a weakening Carthaginian center. The mathematical and geometric elements of encirclement were beginning to assemble. The Romans had walked into the trap's perimeter. Now the walls would begin to close. While cavalry fought and died on the flanks, the main event was unfolding in the center. 76,000 Roman infantry, compressed into a formation deeper and narrower than standard doctrine, began their advance across the dusty plain toward Hannibal's crescent. To Roman eyes, the Carthaginian formation looked like a tactical error. The center bulged forward, convex, with Gallic and Iberian infantry forming the highest point of the arc. This seemed to be the weakest part of Hannibal's line. Lightly armed barbarians positioned exactly where Roman doctrine said to concentrate force. It looked like an invitation to break through. It was precisely that. The Roman infantry advanced with the confidence of men who had conquered Italy, who represented a military tradition that measured success in generations of victory. Their formation, so deep that men in the rear ranks couldn't even see the enemy, was designed to function as a single massive force. The front ranks would make contact, engage the enemy, and the weight of ranks behind would push forward relentlessly. The sheer mass of 80,000 armored men moving forward together should, by any reasonable calculation, break through any defense. Military theory said so. Experience said so. What theory and experience didn't account for was that the defense was designed to break. When the Roman front rank struck the Gallic and Iberian center, the fighting was immediate and ferocious. The Gauls, many fighting bare-chested with their long slashing swords, were aggressive and fearless. The Iberians with their falcata swords were professional and disciplined. But they were also outnumbered and facing the weight of the entire Roman center. The crescent began to give ground. Polybius is explicit about what happened next. This was not a rout, not a collapse, but a controlled tactical withdrawal. The Gauls and Iberians were falling back according to plan, flexing like a bow under pressure. From the Roman perspective, this looked like success. The enemy center was breaking. The Romans pushed harder, men in the front ranks surging forward, men in the rear ranks pressing the men ahead, the entire formation compressing even further as it advanced into the space the Carthaginians were vacating. The crescent that had bulged toward them was flattening. Then it became concave. The Romans were no longer pushing against a convex arc. They were flowing into a pocket, a U-shaped trap that was deepening with every step they took. Hannibal had positioned himself with his brother Mago directly behind this center, at the point where pressure was greatest, where his Gallic and Iberian troops were taking casualties and giving ground. His presence wasn't ceremonial. Ancient armies fought with greater determination when they could see their commanders sharing their danger. And Hannibal needed this center to hold just long enough. Not to win, but to absorb, to channel, to funnel 76,000 Romans into exactly the position where the Libyan heavy infantry on both flanks could do their work. The conditions inside the Roman formation were deteriorating rapidly. The Volturnus wind, blowing from the southwest, was driving dust directly into Roman faces. Thousands of feet churning the silty river soil created clouds that reduced visibility to perhaps 50 meters or less. Men in the rear ranks couldn't see anything but the backs of the soldiers in front of them. Men in the front ranks could barely see through the dust and the press of their own formation. The compression that was supposed to be a strength was becoming a constraint. Soldiers were so close together that using weapons effectively became difficult. Polybius would later describe Romans as being incapable of using their arms due to the density of the formation. Men needed space to swing a sword, to thrust with a spear, to maneuver a shield. When you're pressed so tightly that you can barely lift your arms, combat effectiveness plummets. But the momentum of the advance carried them forward anyway. The ranks behind, unable to see what was happening at the front, kept pushing. The men at the front, trapped by the pressure of those behind, had no choice but to keep moving forward, even as the space to fight narrowed. What the Romans couldn't see through the dust and the tunnel vision of combat was the geometric transformation of the battlefield. The crescent had become a pocket. The Romans had formed a dense mass inside a three-sided box. At the front, Gauls and Iberians were still fighting and falling back. On both sides, the flanks of the pocket were being formed by the still uncommitted Libyan heavy infantry. The Romans were walking deeper into a trap whose walls were about to become solid. Modern historians analyzing Polybius's detailed tactical description note the psychological dimension of what was happening. Combat creates tunnel vision. Adrenaline narrows perception. The dust was literal blindness, layered on top of psychological blindness. Units were losing contact with each other. Cohesion was fragmenting. The army that had marched onto the field as a unified force was becoming isolated pockets of men fighting without coordination, without clear orders, without understanding what was happening beyond their immediate vicinity. The Romans thought they were winning. From their perspective, limited, dust-choked, compressed, they were pushing the enemy back. The enemy center was giving ground. This must mean success. What they couldn't see was that every step forward was a step deeper into the killing zone, that the flanks of their formation were completely exposed to fresh enemy troops, that their own density was preventing them from reinforcing weak points or responding to threats, that Hannibal's seemingly weak center was exactly as weak as it needed to be to absorb the Roman assault without breaking too soon. For perhaps 20 to 30 minutes, this phase continued. The Romans advanced. The Gauls and Iberians fell back. The pocket deepened. Casualties on both sides mounted. The Gauls and Iberians were taking significant losses holding the line, while Romans in the front ranks were killing and dying in the brutal close quarters fighting that Polybius describes. But the overall geometry was working exactly as Hannibal had designed. The Romans were completely committed. The entire weight of their army was pressing forward into the pocket. And on both flanks, the elite Libyan infantry stood motionless in their captured Roman armor, waiting for the moment when the trap would spring shut. That moment was coming. But before the Libyans could close the trap from the sides, another disaster was about to strike the Romans from an unexpected direction. Because while the infantry center absorbed the Roman assault, Hasdrubal's victorious cavalry had completed their next objective. When the Roman infantry had penetrated deep enough that their flanks were fully exposed, Hannibal gave the order that would transform a battle into an annihilation. The elite Libyan heavy infantry, 8,000 to 10,000 of his most experienced and disciplined warriors, had stood motionless on both flanks throughout the infantry engagement. They had watched the Romans advance past them into the pocket. They had maintained formation while Gauls and Iberians fell back and died. Now, at the precise moment when the Roman formation was maximally vulnerable, they moved. The Libyan units pivoted 90 degrees and charged inward from both flanks simultaneously. This wasn't a chaotic rush. Ancient sources describe a controlled professional assault that hit both sides of the Roman formation at once. What had been a forward-pushing assault on the Carthaginian center instantly transformed into a static, three-sided battle. Romans were no longer advancing. They were surrounded on three sides and fighting for survival. The psychological and tactical dimensions of this moment were devastating. The Libyans were wearing captured Roman armor and carrying Roman shields taken from Lake Trasimene. In the dust and chaos, Romans, seeing figures in Roman armor approaching from the flanks, had precious seconds of confusion. Were these reinforcements? Lost units rejoining the formation? The realization that these were enemies came only when the killing started. Polybius notes this armor deception as a specific element of Hannibal's plan, a layer of psychological warfare compounding the tactical encirclement. The Roman formation that had been designed as a battering ram became a trap for its own soldiers. The depth that was supposed to provide pushing power now meant men in the center were surrounded by their own comrades on all sides. The density that was supposed to create unstoppable momentum now prevented maneuver. Units couldn't wheel to face flank attacks. Soldiers couldn't create new formations to deal with threats from multiple directions. The compressed mass of humanity that had pushed forward so confidently was now a mass of confusion, pressure, and mounting casualties. What the Libyans achieved in this phase was something infantry combat rarely produces: coordinated assaults on both flanks at the same time by fresh, elite troops against enemies who were already engaged already compressed, already disoriented. Military theorists studying ancient sources note the extraordinary command and control this required. Hannibal had to time the attack precisely. Too early, and the Romans wouldn't be committed. Too late, and the Gauls and Iberians might break. He had to communicate the order to widely separated units simultaneously. He had to trust that his Libyan commanders would execute with the discipline and coordination the plan required. The outer ranks of the Roman formation began dying faster than the inner ranks could reinforce. This was the cruel mathematics of encirclement. Every Roman who fell was fighting on the perimeter. Every Carthaginian who fell could be replaced by another warrior. Stepping forward, Romans in the interior of the formation couldn't get to the fighting. They were trapped by their own numbers, by the press of bodies, by the limitation of space. Men were being lifted off their feet by the pressure of the crowd. The heat of the August sun, combined with the heat of tens of thousands of bodies pressed together, was creating conditions of rapid exhaustion. Consul Paulus, already wounded from the earlier slinger's stone, was somewhere in this chaos. Ancient sources don't provide precise minute-by-minute tracking of his movements, but they document where his body was found. In the thick of the infantry fighting, surrounded by dead legionaries, covered with additional wounds beyond the first. He had made his way from the collapsed right cavalry wing to the infantry center, perhaps attempting to rally cohesion, perhaps simply choosing to die with his soldiers rather than flee. The decision was honorable and futile. The Roman formation was beyond rallying. It had become a killing zone. The three-sided battle continued for what historians estimate was perhaps 30 to 40 minutes. This wasn't a quick collapse. Romans were fighting desperately, and they were good at fighting. Individual cohorts and maniples held together, killing Carthaginians even as their overall situation deteriorated. The Gauls and Iberians in the center, who had absorbed the initial Roman assault, were taking horrendous casualties. Ancient casualty figures suggest 4,000 Gauls died in this battle, the highest losses among Hannibal's troops. They had done their job, absorb the Roman attack and channel it into the pocket. But that job had a price. Yet even as Romans fought with the courage of veteran soldiers, the geometry and mathematics were working against them. They were fighting on three sides. They couldn't maneuver. They couldn't retreat. The dust was choking. The heat was draining. The compression was preventing effective weapon use. And all of this was happening while 76,000 men tried to fight in a space designed for perhaps 40,000. The density that had seemed like strength was slowly crushing them. But the trap wasn't complete. Terrible as the three-sided encirclement was, Romans were still holding their rear. Disciplined cohorts in the rear ranks were forming defensive lines, creating space, attempting to organize evacuation of wounded or coordination of reserves. If the battle had remained three-sided, significant numbers of Romans might have fought their way out or maintained cohesion long enough to retreat in order. What destroyed that possibility came from the one direction the Romans thought was secure. Because Hasdrubal's cavalry, having shattered the Roman right wing, had spent the intervening time executing the second and third phases of Hannibal's plan. They had moved across the battlefield, helped scatter the Roman left-wing cavalry, and now they were about to complete history's most perfect tactical encirclement. The rear of the Roman army was about to become the front line. What happened next achieved what military theorists have attempted and almost universally failed to replicate for 2,200 years. The complete double envelopment of a larger enemy force in open battle. After destroying the Roman cavalry on the right wing near the Aufidus River, Hasdrubal had demonstrated tactical discipline that separated competent commanders from exceptional ones. He had regrouped his squadrons rather than pursuing fleeing enemies. He had then moved his heavy cavalry across the rear of the battlefield to the opposite wing. There, the allied Roman cavalry had been engaged with 4,000 Numidian light cavalry in the kind of skirmishing combat that Numidians specialized in. The allied cavalry weren't losing badly, but they weren't winning either. They were being held in place, harassed, unable to commit fully in any direction. When Hasdrubal's 6,000 heavy cavalry arrived and crashed into their flank, the equation changed instantly. Now the allied cavalry faced 10,000 enemy horsemen, fresh, heavy cavalry joining the battle from an unexpected direction. The allied wings shattered. Some fled the field. Others were ridden down by Numidian pursuers who excelled at hunting broken formations. Hasdrubal demonstrated his understanding of Hannibal's plan by what he did next. He didn't pursue. He didn't chase fleeing cavalry off the battlefield to rack up kills. He gathered his squadrons, weary from 2 cavalry battles, but victorious in both, and led them toward the Roman infantry's rear. Polybius uses language that conveys the drama of this moment. Hasdrubal, quote, 11 into the Roman rear. Think about what this meant from the perspective of a Roman legionary in the rear ranks. You've been pushing forward for perhaps an hour. You can't see much through the dust. You're getting fragmentary reports from runners that the front is engaged, that casualties are mounting, that the enemy is tough, but you're advancing. Then you hear sounds from behind you. Hoofbeats, shouting. The distinctive noise of cavalry at the charge. You turn and see thousands of horsemen crashing into what should be your secure rear. The psychological shock was as devastating as the physical impact. The Roman army was now surrounded on all 4 sides. Infantry to the front, infantry on both flanks, cavalry in the rear. Nearly 80,000 men were trapped in a space perhaps 500 meters by 300 meters. Historians' estimates based on the tactical descriptions and the battlefield geography. The circle of combat began to contract. As Polybius describes with precise and chilling language, the Roman army was now a massive, struggling crowd of nearly 80,000 men trapped in a shrinking circle. As the outer files were continually killed, the circle became more and more contracted until the survivors were all killed on the field. The physical conditions inside this human circle were catastrophic. The density of the formation meant soldiers were packed so tightly that Polybius explicitly states they were incapable of using their arms. Men couldn't lift their shields to block, couldn't swing swords with any force, couldn't thrust with spears. The compression created by having the entire army squeezed into an ever-decreasing space meant that combat effectiveness plummeted even as the need for effective combat reached its maximum. The heat became unbearable. August in southern Italy is brutal under normal circumstances. Now add the heat of 76,000 bodies pressed together, the exertion of combat, the stress of mortal fear. Men were wearing armor, metal or hardened leather that conducted heat. Ancient sources note the temperature as a factor. Modern historians calculating the conditions suggest that heat exhaustion and dehydration would have become significant factors within an hour or 2 of this level of exertion in this compression. The dust was now so thick that visibility even within the Roman formation was severely limited. You couldn't see the overall battle. You could barely see past the men immediately around you. This prevented any kind of coordinated response. Commanders trying to rally their units couldn't see what was happening elsewhere. Messengers couldn't get through the press of bodies. Each maniple, each cohort, each small group of soldiers was fighting its own battle, unaware of the larger disaster, unable to coordinate with other units. What Polybius and Livy described next is the systematic nature of the killing. This wasn't a sudden massacre. It was a methodical, hours-long process. The Carthaginians surrounding the circle killed the outer ranks steadily. As Romans fell, the circle contracted. Fresh Carthaginian warriors stepped forward to replace those who were tired or wounded. Romans in the interior couldn't replace their fallen comrades. They couldn't reach the perimeter through the press of their own formation. Modern historians attempting to calculate the timeline suggest the killing phase lasted perhaps 3 to 4 hours. If ancient casualty figures are even approximately correct, this means Romans were dying at a rate of several hundred per minute during the peak killing. Some tried to break out. Small groups, usually organized cohorts that maintained formation discipline, would form a wedge and attempt to punch through the Carthaginian circle. A few succeeded. Ancient sources record perhaps 3,000 men who managed to fight their way out during the battle. Most who tried died in the attempt. The Carthaginian line, though relatively thin compared to the Roman mass, and was composed of professional soldiers who had been winning for 2 years. Breaking through wasn't impossible, but it required organized violence at precisely the moment when organization was collapsing. Others simply stopped fighting. The combination of heat, thirst, exhaustion, wounds, and psychological devastation broke their will. Ancient accounts describe men who had dropped their weapons, who were waiting for death, who lacked even the energy to defend themselves. These men died not from lack of courage, but from the physical impossibility of continuing to fight under the conditions that existed inside the circle. Consul Paulus fell somewhere in this phase. Ancient sources note he was found covered with wounds in the thick of the fighting. He had refused multiple opportunities to save himself. First, when the right cavalry collapsed. Then, as the encirclement formed. He had chosen to fight with his legionaries, and he died with them, one consul among tens of thousands of casualties. Varro, commanding the left cavalry wing, had fled when that wing broke. He would survive the battle with approximately 50 to 70 cavalry, escaping to the town of Venusia. His survival would become controversial, but ancient sources note that a total Roman loss of leadership would have been even more catastrophic than the loss of one consul. By mid-afternoon, the systematic killing had reduced the Roman circle to a final core of survivors. These men were exhausted, wounded, surrounded, and hopeless. Some fought to the end. Others surrendered. Livy records details that modern historians view skeptically, but which convey the horror of what happened. Men who buried their own heads in holes they dug in the earth to suffocate themselves. Men who had been hamstrung by cavalry as they fled, lying on the ground begging their killers to finish the job. Whether these specific details are factual or literary embellishment by Livy, writing 2 centuries later, they communicate the psychological devastation of a systematic slaughter that lasted hours. When the killing finally slowed as the sun descended toward the Apulian hills, what remained on the field represented one of the most catastrophic military defeats in human history. The mathematics alone tell the story. 76,000 Romans had deployed for battle. Perhaps 14 to 15,000 would escape, most of them camp guards who had never entered the fight. The rest were dead, captured, or wounded so severely they would die in the coming days. The casualty figures recorded by ancient historians remain disputed to this day, a debate that reveals as much about the limitations of historical record as it does about the scale of the massacre. Polybius, writing approximately 50 years after the battle after interviewing survivors and studying what records existed, states that 70,000 Roman infantry were killed, 10,000 captured, and perhaps 3,000 survived the actual battle, Of the 6,000 cavalry, he claims only 370 survived. Livy, writing 2 centuries after the event, but drawing on earlier sources that may have included the contemporary historian Quintus Fabius Pictor, gives somewhat lower figures: 48,200 killed, with roughly 3,000 infantry and 1,500 cavalry captured. Both ancient historians agree the battle produced unprecedented carnage. Modern scholars examining these numbers have generated significant debate. Some historians, noting the practical difficulties of killing this many men in a few hours with ancient weapons, propose much lower figures. In 1891, Cantalupi suggested Roman losses between 10,500 and 16,000. Martin Samuels, writing in 1990, questioned whether Hannibal's cavalry could have prevented so many infantry from escaping to the rear, proposing lower casualties. Michael Clodfelter captures the skepticism directly. Quote, 15. Yet most modern historians, while acknowledging the challenges of ancient casualty reporting, accept figures in the range of 50 to 60,000 Roman dead. The reasons have to do with specific documented details that make the high casualty count plausible. First, the complete encirclement prevented retreat. Second, the systematic nature of the killing described by Polybius, the shrinking circle, provides a mechanism for sustained casualty rates. Third, the officer casualties are documented in extraordinary detail, suggesting Romans kept careful records of who died. Fourth, the political and demographic consequences that followed make sense only if Rome lost a catastrophic percentage of its military-age male population. Those officer casualties tell their own story about the scale of the disaster. Consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus died fighting with the infantry. 2 former consuls, Marcus Attilius Regulus and Gnaeus Servilius Geminus, both veterans of previous campaigns, died in the center of the formation. Marcus Minucius Rufus, who had been master of horse during Fabius's dictatorship, essentially co-dictator, died at Cannae. 29 of 48 military tribunes died. Approximately 80 senators died, representing a massive portion of Rome's governing body. 2 quaestors died. At least 200 knights of equestrian rank died. These aren't the kinds of detailed casualties you invent or exaggerate. Rome kept careful records of its aristocracy. These were men with families, descendants, memorials. Their deaths were documented and verified. When a generation later Polybius's patron Scipio Aemilianus spoke of his grandfather Paulus dying at Cannae, this wasn't legend. It was documented family history. The officer casualties alone suggest an army that fought to destruction rather than rooting and escaping with most of its forces intact. Carthaginian casualties, by comparison, were significant but not devastating. Polybius reports 5,700 dead, 4,000 Gauls, 1,500 Hispanics and Africans, 200 cavalry. Livy says about 8,000 of his bravest men. The Gallic casualties were concentrated among those who had held the center of the crescent, absorbing the initial Roman assault. These men had done their job, channel and contain the Roman advance. But that job had been lethal. Hannibal's army, though victorious, had been bloodied. Livy's account includes graphic details that modern historians approach skeptically, but which convey the psychological impact of the slaughter. He describes Romans found with their heads buried in holes they had dug in the earth, having chosen suffocation over facing their killers. Others found with slashed hamstrings, unable to flee, begging Carthaginians to end their suffering. Consul Paulus discovered sitting upright against a stone, so covered with wounds his body was barely recognizable, having refused offers of escape to die with his soldiers. Whether these specific images are documentary fact or literary embellishment by an author writing with dramatic intent 2 centuries after the battle. They communicate something important. The Romans who survived and recorded this battle considered it uniquely horrific, even by the brutal standards of ancient warfare. The comparative scale becomes clear when placed against other conflicts. Adrian Goldsworthy's comparison to the first day of the Somme isn't rhetorical flourish, it's mathematical. The Somme saw approximately 20,000 British deaths on July 1st, 1916. Cannae, even using conservative modern estimates, produced comparable or higher casualties in less time, with weapons that required personal, exhausting, close-quarters violence. Modern historians calculating from verified total casualties and estimated battle duration suggest that during the peak killing phase inside the encircled Roman formation, Romans were dying at a rate that modern analysis indicates was approximately 100 per minute. This isn't an ancient statistic. It's a modern inference from dividing documented casualties by estimated time. But it provides context for the scale of systematic slaughter. The percentage of Rome's total military manpower lost at Cannae amplifies the disaster. Historians estimate that Rome and its Italian allies had approximately 700,000 men of military age. The 86,000 deployed at Cannae represented roughly 12% of that total. But those were the trained, equipped, combat-ready soldiers. The death of 50 to 70,000 in a single afternoon represented approximately 8 to 10% of Rome's total military-age male population, and perhaps 20% of its immediately available combat power. This wasn't just a lost battle. It was demographic catastrophe. Survivors were few and scattered. Approximately 14 to 15,000 Romans escaped, most of them the 10,000 left guarding the camps who never entered the battle. Perhaps 3,000 broke out during the fighting. Consul Varro fled with 50 to 70 cavalry when the Allied wing collapsed. These men would straggle into nearby towns, Venusia, Canusium, over the next days, bringing news of the disaster. The prisoners Hannibal took, perhaps 10,000 based on ancient sources, would become pawns in a negotiation that would reveal as much about Roman character as the battle itself. When word of Cannae reached Rome 2 days later, the city that had dispatched the largest army in its history waited to learn if anyone was coming home. What arrived instead was confirmation that on August 2nd, 216 BC, 76,400 Romans had deployed for battle on the plains of Cannae. Within 6 hours, the largest field army the Republic had ever assembled had been effectively destroyed. The numbers, even accounting for ancient exaggeration and modern skepticism, describe one of the deadliest single days in pre-modern military history. Rome had sent a generation of soldiers to crush an invasion. Cannae had annihilated them. When survivors began reaching Rome on August 4th, 2 days after the battle, the city erupted into chaos that ancient sources describe as unprecedented, even by the standards of a republic accustomed to war. The initial reports were fragmentary, confused, and horrifying. A consul dead, the army destroyed, exact numbers unknown, Hannibal's location unknown. Whether he was marching on Rome remained uncertain. The gap between complete information and terrifying rumor created space for panic to flourish. Appian, writing centuries later but drawing on earlier sources, describes streets _quote _ 17 _ this wasn't ordinary grief. Cannae had struck at a significant portion of Rome's military-age male population. The 80 senators who died represented not just political leadership, but the heads of Rome's most important families. The 200 knights killed were the equestrian class, the wealthy citizens who formed the social structure below the Senate. The 48,000 or more dead included men from every social class, every region of Roman Italy. every family network that held the Republic together. The Senate, severely depleted, was forced to meet in continuous emergency session. Approximately 1/4 of the Senate had died at Cannae. The institutional knowledge, the experienced leadership, the men who had guided Rome through previous crises were simply gone. Those who remained had to make decisions about survival with incomplete information and diminishing options. The first priority was defense. Rome's walls were ancient, strong, and extensive, but they required men to defend them. With the field army destroyed, Rome had to scrape together whatever forces remained. The social fabric of the city was straining. Families with men in the army had no information about who had survived. The custom was for magistrates to post casualty lists in the forum, but the lists from Cannae would take days to compile from the scattered survivors. In the meantime, uncertainty tortured thousands of households. Were there sons, brothers, husbands, fathers among the dead? Among the captured? Among the few who escaped? The inability to perform proper funerals, to honor the dead according to custom, added spiritual anguish to emotional devastation. There were also practical considerations that ancient sources document. Rome's treasury, depleted by 2 years of war, now faced the need to raise, equip, and train entirely new armies. The fields surrounding Rome needed to be harvested, but many of the men who should have been doing that work were dead in Apulia. The economic disruption of losing such a large percentage of the productive male population would have consequences far beyond the immediate military crisis. The question everyone was asking was whether Hannibal would march on Rome. The distance from Cannae to the city was approximately 250 miles, perhaps 2 weeks' march for an army. Could Rome organize defense in time? Would Rome's walls hold against an enemy who had just achieved the impossible? Should the government evacuate? Ancient sources record that some voices in the Senate proposed abandoning Italy entirely, fleeing to Sicily or overseas colonies. The psychological impact of Cannae was such that even the Senate, the body that had governed Rome's expansion across Italy, briefly considered whether the Republic itself could survive. What kept Rome from collapse was institutional resilience built over centuries. The Senate, depleted as it was, continued to function. Magistrates continued to exercise authority. The city's population, terrified as they were, didn't riot or flee en masse. The system held. But holding the system together while facing the possibility of Hannibal appearing before the gates required Romans to confront a reality they had never seriously considered: that Rome might lose, that centuries of expansion might end, that the Republic's survival wasn't guaranteed by destiny or the gods' favor, but would depend on choices made in the desperate weeks following their worst military defeat. On the blood-soaked field at Cannae, as the sun set on August 2nd, Hannibal faced a decision that historians have debated for more than 2,000 years. Maharbal, his commander of Numidian cavalry, reportedly urged immediate action. According to Livy's account, Maharbal promised that if Hannibal moved immediately, they could be dining on the Capitoline Hill in Rome within 5 days. When Hannibal refused, citing the need for rest and consideration, Maharbal supposedly delivered one of history's most famous military criticisms. Quote, 18:19. The exchange, whether historical fact or legend that crystallized around Hannibal's decision, captures the fundamental question: why didn't Hannibal march on Rome after the greatest tactical victory in military history? Ancient sources debated this. Roman historians portrayed it as a failure of nerve or will, a hesitation that saved Rome. Modern historians, with the benefit of analyzing Hannibal's entire strategic situation, largely defend his decision. The practical realities were significant. Hannibal's army, though victorious, was exhausted. They had fought for 6 hours in August heat, much of it in brutal close-quarters combat. The cavalry had engaged in multiple charges. The infantry center had absorbed a sustained assault. Casualties, while far lower than Roman losses, were still substantial. 8,000 Carthaginian dead, with perhaps another several thousand wounded, meant Hannibal had lost 15 to 20% of his force. These weren't easily replaceable. Hannibal operated far from any Carthaginian base, deep in enemy territory, with no reinforcements available. More critically, Hannibal lacked siege equipment. His army had crossed the Alps without heavy machinery. It would have been impossible to transport. Taking a city of Rome's size, with its ancient walls and defensive positions, without siege towers, battering rams, catapults, or the engineering corps needed to conduct siege operations, was probably impossible. Rome could simply shut its gates and wait. Hannibal had no logistics train capable of sustaining a siege. His army lived by moving, by foraging, by seizing supplies from captured territory. A static siege would starve his own forces before it threatened Rome's much larger food reserves. The strategic objective Hannibal had pursued since crossing the Alps wasn't the physical capture of Rome. His goal was to shatter Rome's alliance system, to detach the Italian Soci who provided Rome with seemingly inexhaustible manpower reserves. Every battle Hannibal fought, every demonstration of Roman vulnerability, was calculated to convince Italian cities that Rome couldn't protect them, that they should switch allegiance to Carthage while they still could. Marching past allied cities that might defect in order to besiege a city he probably couldn't take would squander the political opportunity that Cannae created. Hannibal made the decision to move south into Campania, where the wealthiest and most important Italian cities were located. His calculation proved partially correct. Major cities would defect. But the choice not to march on Rome immediately gave the Republic time to recover, to reorganize, to demonstrate that despite catastrophic defeat, Rome still existed, still functioned, still intended to continue fighting. Whether Hannibal's decision was correct remains debated. What's clear is that he chose long-term strategy over immediate exploitation of tactical victory. And that choice had profound consequences for the war's trajectory. Hannibal's next move revealed his assumption that Rome would behave according to the normal conventions of ancient warfare. After a catastrophic defeat, states negotiate. They ransom prisoners. They seek terms. Hannibal sent a delegation of 10 Roman prisoners to the Senate to negotiate the return of thousands of captured Romans at a standard rate of 300 drachmas per man. The prisoners argued their case. They were soldiers who had fought bravely and surrendered only when all hope was lost. Ransoming them would be cheaper than purchasing and training new slaves to replace them as workers. They reminded the Senate that Rome's ancestors had ransomed prisoners from the Gauls after the disaster at the Alea River, and from Pyrrhus after Heraclea. The Senate's response revealed something fundamental about Roman political culture that Hannibal had failed to understand. Titus Manlius Torquatus, a senior senator of old-fashioned and harsh disposition, rose to speak against the ransom. Livy preserves what purports to be his speech, and whether the exact words are historical or Livy's literary reconstruction, the argument captures the Senate's logic. Torquatus argued that these men had disgraced themselves. They had fled to their camp when they should have fought in the line. They had surrendered the camp when they should have defended it with their weapons. They had failed at every point where Roman military virtue required success. When it was your duty to keep your rank and fight, you fled to your camp. Torquatus reportedly said. When you ought to have fought at the rampart, you surrendered your camp. You are useless alike in the field and in the camp. His conclusion was stark. Better to give up these prisoners to Hannibal than to ransom them, and thus signal that Rome rewarded failure. The Senate, despite the fact that many senators had relatives among the prisoners, voted against the ransom. This wasn't mercy or sentiment. It was calculated political signaling. Rome was telling its own soldiers that surrender wasn't an option, that they must either win or die, that the Republic would never negotiate with its enemies, regardless of the human cost. Rome was also demonstrating to Hannibal that despite losing the largest army it had ever fielded, despite facing possible siege, despite panic in the streets, the Senate would not treat Cannae as decisive, would not acknowledge defeat, would not negotiate. The prisoners were informed of the Senate's decision. Most were eventually sold into slavery by Hannibal, a standard practice for prisoners whose ransom wasn't paid. A few were executed. One prisoner who had left the delegation, claiming he needed to return to Hannibal's camp for some forgotten item and thus technically fulfilled his parole oath, tried to remain in Rome. When this technicality became known, the Senate ordered him seized and delivered to Hannibal by state guards. The Senate's code of honor was absolute. A promise made to an enemy was still a promise. The refusal to ransom the Cannae prisoners became a defining moment in Roman self-conception. It was harsh. It was cruel to the families of those men. It violated normal, ancient practice. But it achieved something strategically important. It told Rome's remaining soldiers that retreat and surrender would not be rewarded with eventual return home. It told Rome's enemies that the Republic would not behave as defeated states normally behave. It told Rome's Italian allies that the city might lose battles, but it hadn't lost its will to fight. Hannibal was left frustrated and financially disappointed. He had expected to profit from prisoner ransoms, a standard part of ancient warfare economics. Instead, he had thousands of prisoners he couldn't ransom and couldn't afford to feed. The Romans had turned even their defeat into a form of resistance. They had transformed the convention of prisoner exchange into another battlefield, where they would demonstrate that losing to Rome, even catastrophically, didn't mean Rome would acknowledge loss. The Senate's defiance required backing with action. Rome needed armies, but the traditional manpower pool had been catastrophically depleted. The solution involved measures so desperate they would have been unthinkable before Cannae. Marcus Junius Pera was appointed dictator, given emergency powers to organize defense and raise new forces. Within a month of the disaster, Rome fielded 4 new legions. The composition of these legions reveals the depth of the crisis. First, the property requirements that traditionally limited military service were eliminated. Rome was enlisting men too poor to afford their own equipment. The state would have to pay for their arms and armor, a significant treasury burden. Second, the minimum age for service was lowered. Boys younger than the traditional fighting age were enrolled and armed. Third, criminals and debtors were released from prison on condition of military service. Men who had been judged unfit for civilian life were now deemed acceptable for defending the Republic. Most dramatically, Rome purchased 8,000 young, healthy slaves from their private owners and armed them as soldiers. These men, called volones, were promised freedom if they fought bravely. This broke a fundamental Roman social principle. Slaves weren't citizens, couldn't be trusted with weapons, were property, not participants in the civic body. But the alternative was leaving Rome defenseless. The volones would become a permanent unit, fighting through the rest of the war, eventually earning their freedom and citizenship through military service. The financial arrangements were equally desperate. The treasury, depleted by war expenses, couldn't pay for this mobilization through normal means. The Senate resorted to private loans from wealthy citizens, essentially requiring the rich to fund the war from personal resources with promises of eventual repayment. This created an odd situation where Rome's elite were financing the Republic's survival while simultaneously risking their lives. Many of the wealthy citizens providing loans would themselves serve in the new legions. The spiritual crisis matched the military one. Romans believed the gods' favor was essential for military success. Cannae suggested the gods were profoundly angry with Rome. But why? What ritual failure, what offense, what neglect had caused divine punishment so severe? The Senate dispatched Quintus Fabius Pictor, a senator and historian who had fought in the war, to consult the oracle at Delphi in Greece. What rites must Rome perform to regain divine favor? While Pictor traveled to Greece, Rome performed rites that revealed the depth of its spiritual desperation. Human sacrifice, and practice that had become rare and controversial in Roman religion, was revived. 2 Gauls, a man and a woman, and 2 Greeks, also a man and a woman, were buried alive in the Forum Boarium, the cattle market area of Rome. This was an ancient rite, performed only in Rome's most desperate moments, meant to appease the chthonic deities of the underworld. The symbolism was clear. Representatives of Rome's enemies were being sent to the underworld as offerings, with the prayer that the gods would be satisfied and cease punishing Rome. Ancient sources record other religious innovations. The Sibylline books, prophetic texts consulted only in crises, were examined for guidance. Special games and festivals were organized. Temples were promised to gods if they would grant victory. Every possible means of securing divine assistance was explored. This wasn't superstition, it was the Roman worldview. Military defeat meant divine disfavor. Divine disfavor could only be addressed through proper ritual. If ritual required desperate measures, including practices most Romans found disturbing, then those measures must be taken. The combination of military and religious emergency measures reveals a society under existential stress, but not collapsing. The Senate continued to function. The religious institutions continued to operate. The social hierarchy, though strained, held together. Rome was doing what Rome did: organizing, systematizing, finding practical and spiritual solutions to seemingly impossible problems. The question was whether these desperate measures would be sufficient when Hannibal's veterans came to test Rome's newly enlisted slaves, boys, and criminals behind whatever defenses the city could organize. Cannae's strategic impact unfolded in the weeks and months following the battle, as Italian cities that had been Rome's allies calculated whether continued loyalty was worth the risk. The defections would transform the war, giving Hannibal bases, resources, and legitimacy in Italy, but also revealing the limits of his victory. The most significant defection was Capua, the second largest city in Italy. Capua was wealthy, sophisticated, and had long chafed under Roman dominance. After Cannae, Capua's leaders decided that Hannibal would win the war, and that switching sides while they still could choose freely was preferable to waiting until Hannibal conquered them by force. Capua opened its gates to Hannibal and offered him a winter base. The city's betrayal of Rome was profound. Capua had been Rome's most important Campanian ally, strategically positioned in the wealthy agricultural region south of Rome. Syracuse in Sicily, ruled by the young tyrant Hieronymus, broke its alliance with Rome and made terms with Carthage. This opened a new theater of war in Sicily, forcing Rome to divert legions that might otherwise have been used in Italy. Tarentum and Arpi in southern Italy also defected, providing Hannibal with ports where Carthaginian reinforcements might theoretically arrive. Various Samnite and Lucanian communities in the southern mountains, ethnic groups that had traditionally opposed Roman expansion, saw Hannibal's invasion as an opportunity to regain independence and joined the Carthaginian cause. Most strategically consequential, Philip V of Macedon, observing Rome's catastrophic defeat, made an alliance with Hannibal. Philip calculated that Rome, weak and distracted by Italian warfare, was vulnerable in its interests across the Adriatic. This alliance would drag Rome into the First Macedonian War, another drain on resources and attention that Cannae had made possible. But what didn't happen was as important as what did. The core of Rome's Italian alliance system held. The 12 Latin cities, the colonies that Rome had established across central Italy, and most importantly, the majority of Italian communities whose soldiers had died alongside Romans at Cannae, remained loyal. When envoys from Hannibal visited these cities offering freedom from Rome, they were refused. Some cities that considered defection found their pro-Carthaginian factions opposed by pro-Roman factions, and internal conflict prevented clear decisions to switch sides. Why did Rome's core allies stay loyal despite Cannae's demonstration that Rome couldn't protect them militarily? The reasons varied by community, but several factors appear consistently in ancient sources. First, centuries of integration with Rome had created economic, social, and family ties that couldn't easily be severed. Second, Rome had a track record of crushing betrayal with extraordinary ruthlessness. Cities that defected and then were recaptured faced destruction, enslavement, or loss of territory far more severe than any burden Rome normally imposed on loyal allies. Third, Hannibal couldn't be everywhere. A city that defected to Carthage might find itself isolated when Hannibal moved to campaign elsewhere, facing Roman retribution without Carthaginian protection. Fourth, and perhaps most important, Rome's refusal to negotiate after Cannae impressed Italian allies, even as it horrified them. A state that wouldn't ransom its own soldiers, that would mobilize slaves rather than discuss terms, that would sacrifice humans to the gods rather than admit defeat, was demonstrating commitment to victory that went beyond rational calculation. You might bet against Rome's military competence after Cannae, but betting against Rome's willingness to continue fighting, to endure any sacrifice, to outlast any opponent regardless of cost. That was a harder bet to make. The defections gave Hannibal strategic depth in Italy. He had bases, he had allies, he had legitimacy beyond being a foreign invader, but he didn't have what he needed most. Rome's core alliance system fractured to the point where he could isolate and defeat the city itself. The 12 Latin cities and the central Italian colonies held. As long as they held, Rome could continue to raise armies, could continue to fight, could continue to demonstrate to wavering allies that the Republic survived. Hannibal had won the battle. The question of winning the war remained open. And with each month that passed without Rome collapsing, without Rome negotiating, without Rome doing what defeated states were supposed to do, that question became more uncertain. After Cannae, Rome never again sought a decisive battle against Hannibal's main army. The Senate, learning from catastrophe, returned to the Fabian strategy that political pressure had forced them to abandon before Cannae. But this wasn't merely defensive warfare. It was a systematic campaign to neutralize Hannibal's advantages while exploiting his weaknesses. The core insight was that Hannibal operated on a strategic knife edge. He was deep in enemy territory with no supply lines to Carthage. His army lived by moving, by foraging, by seizing supplies from captured cities and farmland. If Roman armies could shadow him, harass his foragers, prevent him from settling into secure winter quarters, they could slowly wear down his force without risking another battle of annihilation. When Hannibal moved to attack a city, Roman armies would move to defend or reinforce it. When Hannibal besieged strong points, Roman forces would threaten his supply lines. The strategy required patience, discipline, and the willingness to endure criticism from those who wanted glory through direct combat. More aggressive was the Roman campaign to recapture cities that had defected to Hannibal. Without Hannibal's army present, Italian cities that had allied with Carthage were vulnerable. Roman armies began systematically besieging these cities. Capua, the most important defector, faced years of Roman military pressure, finally falling in 211 BC. Its punishment was severe. The ruling council was executed, the population enslaved, the city's autonomy abolished. The message was clear. Defection would be punished with a severity that made even battlefield defeat look merciful. Rome also opened new theaters to stretch Carthaginian resources. Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had survived Cannae as a young military tribune, was sent to Spain to attack Carthaginian holdings there. The goal was to prevent reinforcements from reaching Hannibal, while also securing the silver mines that funded Carthaginian war efforts. When Hasdrubal, Hannibal's brother, attempted to march a second Carthaginian army to Italy in 207 BC, he was intercepted and defeated at the Metaurus River in northern Italy. Hasdrubal's severed head was thrown into Hannibal's camp. The message: you're isolated, you're alone. No one is coming to help you. The cumulative effect of this strategy was that Hannibal, despite never losing a major battle in Italy, slowly lost the capacity to win the war. His army dwindled through combat attrition, disease, and the simple fact that casualties couldn't be replaced. Cities he had won through alliances were recaptured by Rome and punished brutally. His freedom of movement was constrained as Roman armies learned to coordinate multiple forces to box him in. The brilliant tactical general was being strangled by strategic attrition. By 203 BC, Rome had recovered sufficiently to launch an invasion of North Africa itself. Scipio, now commanding Roman forces in Sicily, landed near Carthage and threatened the Carthaginian homeland. Hannibal, who had spent 15 years in Italy achieving tactical miracles but strategic stalemate, was recalled to defend Carthage. The war moved from Italy to Africa. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, Scipio defeated Hannibal in a battle that historians note used Hannibal's own tactical principles. Scipio had studied Cannae. He understood how cavalry could be decisive. He manipulated his formation to counter Hannibal's tactics. The battle was close, but Scipio's victory was complete enough to end the war. Carthage sued for peace on terms that effectively ended its status as an independent great power. The Second Punic War ended with Rome victorious, Carthage humiliated, and Hannibal, history's greatest tactical genius, having demonstrated that brilliance in battle doesn't guarantee strategic success. The war that Cannae made urgent had been won not through matching Hannibal's genius, but through refusing to quit. Through institutional resilience, through willingness to endure losses that would have destroyed other states, through strategic patience that slowly neutralized tactical superiority, Rome emerged from the Punic Wars as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. The republic that nearly died at Cannae became an empire. The citizens who had watched their largest army annihilated in 6 hours became the rulers of the Mediterranean world. Resilience, it turned out, mattered more than any single battle, no matter how perfectly executed. The Battle of Cannae endures in military memory more than 2,000 years after the dust settled on the Apulian plain, for reasons that transcend its immediate historical impact. It represents the theoretical ideal that every military commander dreams of achieving: the complete annihilation of the enemy force through superior tactics despite numerical inferiority. The double envelopment, the simultaneous attack on both flanks and rear, remains the supreme tactical goal taught at military academies worldwide. Count Alfred von Schlieffen, architect of Germany's World War I strategy, studied Cannae obsessively. His Schlieffen plan attempted to replicate Hannibal's encirclement on an enormous scale, a massive wheeling movement through Belgium to envelop French forces against the German border. The plan failed, partly because replicating Cannae with armies of millions across hundreds of miles proved as impossible as it was ambitious. But the attempt demonstrates Cannae's enduring influence on military thinking. Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in World War II, observed that, quote, 22. The phrase, quote, 23 itself, derives from analysis of Cannae. Modern military doctrine distinguishes between battles of attrition, where victory comes through wearing down enemy forces, and battles of annihilation, where tactical maneuver achieves complete destruction of enemy capability. Cannae is the template for the latter. What makes Cannae permanently relevant to military education is the perfection of its execution. Hannibal integrated multiple arms: heavy infantry, light infantry, heavy cavalry, light cavalry, skirmishers, in coordinated movements across a complex battle space. He used terrain not just as backdrop, but as tactical factor. He exploited weather conditions to create battlefield effects. He understood enemy doctrine so thoroughly he could predict where they would concentrate force and prepare a reception. He demonstrated patience in allowing his center to absorb punishment while he maneuvered forces for encirclement. The battle is essentially a masterclass in military art. But Cannae also teaches harsh lessons about the limits of tactical genius. Hannibal won the perfect battle and lost the war. His brilliance on the battlefield couldn't overcome strategic realities. He operated without secure supply lines, without reinforcements, without siege capability, against an enemy with far greater resources and manpower reserves. More critically, he couldn't overcome Roman political will. Rome's refusal to accept defeat after Cannae, its willingness to endure catastrophic losses and continue fighting, its institutional resilience. These strategic factors trumped tactical perfection. Modern analysts studying asymmetric warfare and insurgency find Cannae relevant from the opposite direction. When a defender can make victory too costly, when a weaker force can create casualties the stronger force is unwilling to accept, when political will to continue fighting becomes the decisive factor rather than battlefield success, these are the conditions under which tactical superiority becomes insufficient. Cannae nearly broke Rome's will. Rome's survival and eventual victory came not from defeating Hannibal in battle, but from refusing to let battlefield defeat translate into strategic surrender. The casualty figures, even accounting for uncertainty about exact numbers, establish Cannae as one of history's deadliest single days. 70,000 deaths in 6 hours. Modern historians' calculations suggest this produced casualty rates comparable to industrial warfare, despite ancient weapons. The battle demonstrated that given proper tactical setup, ancient armies could kill with efficiency that prefigured modern slaughter. The encirclement turned Cannae from a battle into a massacre. The systematic elimination of an enemy force so complete that it shocked even the ancient world. For military professionals studying Cannae, certain principles emerge as perennially relevant. Know your enemy's doctrine, use terrain and weather as weapons, integrate multiple capabilities in coordinated action, create conditions where enemy strength becomes enemy weakness. Maintain discipline under extreme pressure. and understand that tactical perfection requires meticulous preparation. For civilian leaders, Cannae teaches different lessons. Resilience matters more than any single defeat. Institutional stability can outlast individual genius, and the will to continue fighting can triumph over tactical superiority. The plain at Cannae is quiet now. Agricultural land stretching toward the Apulian hills where the afternoon sun set on August 2nd, 216 BC. Visitors can drive to the approximate battlefield location, marked by modest memorials that acknowledge what happened there, but can't fully capture it. The Aufidus River still flows, smaller now than ancient sources describe, channelized by modern water management. The dust that choked 70,000 dying Romans is held down by irrigation and cultivation. The ground itself remembers nothing, but military commanders remember. 2,200 years later, at every military academy, in every serious study of tactics and strategy, Cannae appears. The diagrams of the crescent formation, the arrows showing cavalry movements, the contraction of the encircled Roman force. These images are as familiar to modern military professionals as they would have been to Polybius 50 years after the battle. On August 2nd, 216 BC, according to sources both ancient and modern, Hannibal Barca achieved what military theorists consider impossible: the complete destruction in open battle of a force nearly twice his size. 70,000 Romans died in 6 hours. Polybius and Livy documented it. Modern historians debate the exact toll, but agree on the catastrophe. The largest army the Roman Republic had ever fielded was annihilated on a plain barely a mile wide by an enemy force that used geometry, weather, terrain, psychology, and tactical coordination to transform numerical advantage into numerical vulnerability. But Rome didn't die. That refusal to die after Cannae, that stubborn resilience in the face of absolute catastrophe, ultimately mattered more than any tactical masterpiece. Hannibal won the greatest tactical victory in military history. Rome won the war. Sometimes the ultimate victory isn't about surviving your enemy's best day. It's about ensuring your enemy's best day doesn't become your last day. About enduring losses that should break you and continuing anyway. About institutional strength outlasting individual genius. The dead of Cannae never knew they were dying in history's most studied battle. They just knew they were dying, compressed in a shrinking circle, blinded by dust, unable to fight effectively, unable to flee, waiting for Carthaginian swords to find them in the chaos. Their deaths bought Rome nothing but time. Time to recover, time to reorganize, time to demonstrate that the Republic would not negotiate, would not quit, would survive catastrophe through sheer institutional stubbornness. 2,200 years later, the lesson endures. Tactics can win battles. Strategy and resilience win wars. And sometimes, losing perfectly doesn't matter as much as refusing to admit you've lost.